What would you do if all you had left in the world was a single piece of paper, folded and worn thin at the creases? A deed to a patch of dust everyone in the territory called worthless, a place abandoned to the sun and the wind. For Caleb Croft, that paper was the sum total of his inheritance, the last remnant of a life that had been washed away by drought and debt. But the truth waiting inside that forgotten parcel of land was a secret buried for 100 years, a quiet promise powerful enough to bring a dying country back to life. Settle in with us and let us know where you're watching from, as we tell a story of how one man's refusal to give up on a forgotten place changed the fate of everyone around him. Caleb Croft rode into the town of Redemption with the Arizona sun beating down on the back of his neck, a heat that felt personal and punishing. The dust of the high desert coated his worn coat, his cracked boots, and the tired flanks of his old horse, Buster. It was a fine, pale dust that got into everything, a constant reminder of the thirst that defined this land. He had just come from a small, windswept cemetery 100 miles east, where he had buried his father. There had been no one else there, just him, the preacher, and the wind. His family's ranch, once a place of green hope, was now in the hands of the bank, its pastures scorched brown, its cattle sold off for a fraction of their worth. All that remained was the deed in his saddlebag, a brittle piece of paper his father had bought from a traveling speculator 15 years ago, a foolish purchase everyone had laughed at then and forgotten since. The town of Redemption didn't look much better than the land around it. Its single street was a river of dust, flanked by false-fronted buildings whose paint was peeling away in long, curling strips. Faces that watched him pass from behind dirty windows were thin and anxious. This was a town holding its breath, waiting for a rain that refused to fall. He dismounted in front of the livery, the leather of his saddle creaking like a tired sigh. He gave the stable hand his last 2 bits to see to Buster, running a calloused hand down the old horse's neck. "Easy, boy," he murmured, "just a little longer." The horse blew out a soft breath, trusting him. It was a trust Caleb wasn't sure he deserved. He felt hollowed out, a vessel filled only with grief and the weight of failure. He had his father's stubborn jaw and quiet hands, but he feared he lacked the hope that had kept the old man going for so long. He walked toward the county clerk's office, the deed feeling both heavy and useless in his coat pocket. He had come not with a plan, but because there was nowhere else left to go. The clerk's office was a small, stuffy room that smelled of dry paper and old ink. A thin man with spectacles perched on his nose looked up from a massive ledger. He introduced himself as Mr. Abernathy, his voice gentle but weary. Caleb placed the deed on the counter. "Come to file this claim," Caleb said, his own voice raspy from disuse. Abernathy unfolded the paper carefully, his brow furrowed in concentration as he read the legal description. He looked up at Caleb, his expression shifting from professional duty to one of quiet pity. "Son," he said softly, "you know what this is, don't you? This is Whisperwind Point. Nothing out there but baked clay and lizards. No water. Hasn't been for 50 years. Before Caleb could respond, a loud, confident voice boomed from the corner of the room. "Whisperwind Point? Did I hear that right?" A large man in a clean duster coat and a fine hat stepped forward. He had the well-fed look of a man who profited from the hardship of others. This was Silas Blackwood, a name Caleb had already heard whispered in the general store, the man buying up failed homesteads for pennies on the dollar. Blackwood laughed, a short, sharp sound that filled the small office. "Well, I'll be. I thought that deed was lost to time. Boy, you've inherited the driest patch of hell in this entire territory." He looked Caleb up and down, taking in his worn clothes, his tired face. The dismissal was total. Silas Blackwood pulled a silver dollar from his waistcoat pocket and spun it on the countertop. The metallic ring seemed to mock the room's quiet desperation. "Tell you what," he said, his smile not reaching his eyes. "I'll give you $1 for it. Save you the ride out there. You can buy yourself a decent meal and be on your way. There's nothing for you at Whisperwind Point." Caleb looked from Blackwood's smug face to the pitying one of the clerk, then down at the deed. It was his father's last foolish hope, a testament to a belief in things unseen. Selling it felt like burying his father all over again. He slowly pushed the silver dollar back across the counter toward Blackwood. "I reckon I'll see it for myself," Caleb said, his voice low but firm. The simple refusal hung in the air. Blackwood's smile vanished. He snatched the coin from the counter, his eyes narrowing. "Your funeral," he sneered. "Don't come crawling back when you're dying of thirst. I won't offer you a penny then." Mr. Abernathy watched the exchange, then took the deed and a pen. He dipped it in the inkwell. "It's your right, Mr. Croft," the clerk said, his voice regaining its professional tone. He made the entry in the ledger with a series of precise, scratching sounds. "The land is yours." Caleb took the validated deed, folded it, and placed it back in his pocket. It felt different now. It wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a stand he had taken, a line drawn in the dust. He nodded once to the clerk and walked out of the office, the sound of Blackwood's derisive chuckle following him into the street. Was it pride that made him refuse? A stubbornness inherited from a long line of men who refused to bend? Or did some deeper instinct, a whisper from the land itself, tell him the dust held a secret worth more than any man's laughter? What would you have done with that deed in your hand, and the whole town waiting for you to fail? Let us know what you think in the comments below, and be sure to subscribe, because Caleb Croft was about to walk out onto that land and listen to what the wind had to say. Caleb made his way to the general store, the only other establishment in Redemption that seemed to have any life in it. The bell above the door announced his arrival with a tinny jangle. The handful of patrons inside, a few ranchers with worried lines etched around their eyes, a woman in a faded calico dress, all turned to look at him. News traveled fast in a town starved for it, and the story of the fool who had claimed Whisperwind Point was apparently already making the rounds. Conversations dropped to whispers. He felt their eyes on him, a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. He ignored them, walking to the counter with a short list in his head. Flour, salt, coffee, a few tins of beans, the barest essentials to see him through the first week. Silas Blackwood was there, of course, leaning against a barrel of nails, holding court. "Mark my words," Blackwood was saying to the storekeeper, his voice loud enough for the entire room to hear. "That fellow won't last 3 days. The sun will bake the sense right out of him, and the coyotes will pick his bones clean. Some men just have to learn the hard way that you can't drink dirt." The men around him chuckled weakly, the sound lacking any real humor. It was the laughter of men who knew their own ranches were only a few dry weeks away from the same fate. Caleb paid for his supplies without a word, his face a mask of calm indifference. He packed the goods into his saddlebags, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He would not give them the satisfaction of seeing him rattled. He was used to being an outsider, used to the quiet judgment of others. It was the silence he carried inside him that was the heaviest burden. As he led Buster out of town, heading toward the faint track that led west, he passed a small, weathered cabin set back from the main road. An old woman sat on the porch in a rocking chair. her eyes dark and knowing. She was watching him. He thought she might be one of the local homesteaders, or perhaps of the native people who had lived in this valley for centuries before towns like Redemption had names. As he drew level with her porch, she stopped rocking. Her voice when she spoke was raspy like dry leaves, but carried a surprising strength. "You," she said. It wasn't a question. Caleb stopped. He met her gaze. She looked from his face to the tired horse, then out toward the barren horizon where his new property lay. "The deep thirst is not of the land," she said, her words slow and measured, each one landing like a carefully placed stone, "but of the men who walk on it. Listen for the old stone's song." He had no idea what she meant. It sounded like a riddle from a dream, but there was no mockery in her eyes, only a strange, solemn gravity. He found himself nodding, a gesture of respect for her age and her stillness. "Thank you, ma'am," he murmured. She gave a single, slow nod in return and began to rock again, her gaze fixed on the distance. The cryptic warning stayed with him as he rode on, a burr caught in the fabric of his thoughts. The town's laughter was easy to dismiss as foolishness, but the old woman's words felt like something else entirely. They felt like a key to a lock he hadn't yet found. The journey to Whisperwind Point was a slow pilgrimage through a wounded landscape. The track was little more than 2 ruts in the cracked earth, winding through sparse creosote and skeletal cholla cactus. The sun was relentless, bleaching the color from the sky, turning the distant mountains into hazy, purple apparitions. Buster plodded onward, his head low, his breathing steady. The horse was an extension of Caleb's own will, tired but unwilling to stop. They were 2 solitary figures in a vast, indifferent emptiness. With every mile, the town of Redemption and its jeering voices grew smaller, until it was just another shimmer on the horizon. Out here, there was only the sound of the wind, the crunch of Buster's hooves on the dry ground, and the steady rhythm of Caleb's own heart. He thought of his father, who had never seen this place but had believed in it enough to trade a good horse for the deed. What had he seen in the speculator's eyes? What promise had he heard? Or was it just a desperate gamble, the last act of a man watching everything he'd built turn to dust? Caleb didn't know. He only knew that he was following that gamble to its end. He arrived at dusk, the time of day when the desert briefly softens. The setting sun painted the western sky in strokes of orange and violet, and the air cooled enough to feel like a blessing on his skin. The property was marked by 4 crumbling stone cairns, just as the deed described, and in the center of the plot stood the reason for its name. It wasn't a windmill as he had pictured it, not one of the tall, spindly American ones. This was older, different. It was a stout, round tower of fitted stone, perhaps 20 feet high, with the broken remnants of wooden arms jutting from its top like fractured bones. It looked Spanish, ancient, a forgotten sentinel from another time. There was no cabin, no barn, no wellhead, just the stone tower and the parched earth. A wave of profound disappointment washed over him, so strong it almost buckled his knees. The town was right. Blackwood was right. There was nothing here. He had traded his last hope for a pile of rocks. He unsaddled Buster and set up a simple camp in the lee of the tower, the stone still holding the day's warmth. As darkness fell, a profound silence descended, broken only by the whisper of the wind moving through the tower's broken frame. It was a lonely, mournful sound. He sat by his small fire, drinking coffee, feeling the full weight of his solitude. He and Buster were utterly alone, camped beside a ruin on a patch of worthless land, with nothing but a riddle from an old woman to hold on to. Days bled into one another, each one a copy of the last, measured by the slow crawl of the sun across the sky. Caleb fell into a simple, hard rhythm. He rose before dawn, made coffee, and watched the light reclaim the desert. He spent his mornings exploring the boundaries of his property, walking the perimeter, learning the feel of the ground beneath his boots. It was just as the clerk had said: baked clay, loose rock, and stubborn scrub. There was no sign of a spring, no dip in the land that might suggest a hidden water source. The stone tower dominated the landscape and his thoughts. He ran his hands over its surface. The stones were masterfully cut and fitted, a kind of craftsmanship he'd never seen in the territory. It was built to last for centuries, far too sturdy for a simple rancher's windmill. Who would build such a thing here, in the middle of nowhere, and for what purpose? He cleared the debris from its base, pulling away dead brush and rocks that had fallen from the top over the years. The foundation was solid, sunk deep into the earth. There was no visible well, no trough, nothing to explain its existence. Yet, as the first week drew to a close, he began to notice something strange. It wasn't a clue he could see, but one he observed. The desert wildlife, usually scattered and shy, seemed drawn to the tower. In the cool hours after dawn, lizards would emerge from the rocks and press their bodies flat against the stones on the north side of the base. Small finches and sparrows would land there, chirping and pecking at the mortar, ignoring the meager shade offered by the nearby scrub. Buster, too, seemed to favor that spot, often standing near the north wall for long stretches, his ears twitching as if listening to something Caleb couldn't hear. At first, Caleb dismissed it as a coincidence, a quirk of the shade or the temperature, but their persistence was too deliberate. One morning, he knelt down and pressed his own palm flat against the cool stone where the animals gathered. He felt nothing, no vibration, no sound. He pressed his ear to the rock, closing his eyes, trying to sense what they sensed. There was only silence. Still, the image of the animals, all facing one way, all drawn to this single spot, refused to leave his mind. It was a detail that didn't fit the picture of a dead and useless place. That afternoon, as he was scanning the ground, his eyes caught another anomaly, a faint line in the soil leading away from the north side of the tower. It wasn't a crack from the dryness. It was too straight, too uniform, disappearing into the scrub. It was almost invisible, something you could only see if the light hit it just right. It looked like the ghost of a buried secret. The line in the dust became an obsession. It was a thread, and he felt a primal urge to pull on it, to see what was on the other end. He took out the shovel he'd brought with him, its wooden handle worn smooth by his father's hands. He started at the base of the tower, right where the animals congregated. The ground was hard, a crust of baked clay that resisted the shovel's blade. He swung his pickaxe, the sharp clang of steel on rock echoing in the silence. Sweat beaded on his forehead and ran in salty rivers down his face, stinging his eyes. Buster stood a short distance away, a patient shadow, watching him with an old, knowing gaze. The work was brutal, punishing. The sun beat down on his back, and his muscles screamed in protest. Every shovelful of dirt felt like a fool's errand, a desperate act of a man with nothing left to lose. He could hear Blackwood's laughter in his mind, the whispers of the townspeople, digging his own grave out of madness. He pushed the thoughts away and focused on the rhythm of the work, the swing of the pick, the scrape of the shovel of the earth. After a few hours, when he was about to give in to exhaustion and despair, his shovel struck something with a dull, metallic thud. It wasn't the sharp ring of rock. It was deeper, more resonant. His heart hammered in his chest. He dropped to his knees and clawed at the dirt with his bare hands. He uncovered a curved, rust-colored surface. It was an iron pipe, thick as his arm. It was old, pitted with corrosion, but intact, and it was running along the exact path of the faint line he had seen in the dust. A surge of adrenaline shot through him, erasing his fatigue. He wasn't mad. There was something here. He began to dig with renewed purpose, following the pipe as it snaked away from the tower. It wasn't a well pipe leading down. It was a transport pipe leading out. But where? There was nothing out here for it to lead to. He dug all day, a long, shallow trench stretching across his property. His hands were raw, blistered, and bleeding, but he didn't stop. The pipe was a question, and he was determined to find the answer. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across his work, he realized the pipe wasn't pumping water up from a well beneath the windmill. The land sloped ever so slightly downward from the tower. The windmill, when it had worked, hadn't been lifting water. It had been pushing it, giving it just enough momentum to travel downhill through this hidden artery, a secret river flowing just beneath the surface of the dead land. He followed the iron pipe for nearly a quarter of a mile, his trench a raw scar across the landscape. It led him to the far edge of his property, to a low, unassuming outcrop of sandstone and granite. And there, the pipe simply disappeared, plunging straight into the rock face. It made no logical sense. Caleb spent the better part of a day searching the outcrop, running his hands over every crack and crevice. He was about to give up, convinced the pipe was just a fragment of some long-abandoned project, when he noticed it. A section of the rock wall, no bigger than a doorway, had a slightly different color and texture. The mortar between these stones was cruder, sandier, as if it had been applied much later than the rest. He tapped it with the head of his pickaxe. The sound wasn't the solid thud of bedrock. It was hollow. He swung the pickaxe harder, and a chunk of the false front crumbled away, revealing dark, weathered wood beneath. It was a door, swollen and jammed tight in its frame, concealed for generations. With his shovel as a lever, he strained against it, his muscles burning. The wood groaned in protest. Then, with a splintering crack, it gave way, swinging inward into darkness. A gust of air rushed out, cool and damp, carrying the scent of deep earth and still water. It was the smell of life. He lit his lantern, the flame flickering in the sudden draft. Holding it high, he stepped over the threshold. The light pushed back the shadows to reveal a set of stone steps, slick with moisture, leading down into the earth. He descended cautiously, the lantern light dancing on the wet stone walls. At the bottom, the narrow passage opened into a vast, cavernous space. He lifted the lantern higher, and the light caught the surface of water. It was a cistern, enormous and man-made, carved directly out of the bedrock. It was easily 50 feet across, and who knew how deep, and it was more than half full of water, so clear he could see the stone floor far below. The air was cool and still, the silence profound. This was the pipe's destination. This was the windmill's purpose. It was a reservoir, a secret lake hidden beneath the desert. On the far wall, just above the waterline, a carving was visible in the lantern's glow. A simple cross, a date from the late 1700s, and the faded seal of a Spanish mission. He finally understood. The tower wasn't a windmill for a farm. It was a pump for a mission outpost, built by monks 2 centuries ago. It had been silently collecting the sparse rainwater, channeling it down here, drop by drop, for decades, long after the mission itself was gone and forgotten. He had not inherited a worthless patch of dirt. He had inherited a miracle. Just as the reality of his discovery was settling in, the world outside began to change. The wind, which had been a constant whisper, rose to a mournful howl. The sky, visible through the cistern's entrance, was darkening, not with the approach of night, but with a churning wall of brown dust. A storm was coming, one of the big ones that could strip the paint from a house and scour the land clean. He had to secure the entrance. As he climbed the steps, the first gusts of wind hit him, carrying sand that stung his skin like needles. He looked out across the darkening plain and saw something on the horizon. A wagon struggling against the wind, one of its wheels wobbling badly, a tired horse straining in the harness. It was moving slowly, erratically, lost in the disorienting gale. He knew they wouldn't make it to town. They wouldn't survive the storm out in the open. He had a choice. He could seal himself in his sanctuary and wait it out, or he could go to them. The decision was made before the thought was even complete. He pulled his bandana over his face and leaned into the wind, fighting his way toward the struggling wagon. It was a family, a man, a woman, and 2 small children huddled in the back, their faces pale with fear. Their name was Miller. Their horse had gone lame, and they had lost the main road in the growing storm. Their water barrels were empty. "Over here!" Caleb yelled over the roar of the wind. "There's shelter." He helped the man unhitch the exhausted horse and led them all, the family, their horse, and his own faithful Buster, back toward the rock outcrop. He guided them through the hidden door and down the stone steps into the calm, quiet stillness of the cistern. The woman gasped when the lantern light revealed the impossible pool of water. The children, who had been crying silently, just stared, their eyes wide with wonder. Caleb filled a cup from the reservoir and handed it to the mother. She drank, then gave it to her children. He watched them drink, their small, parched throats working. In that moment, the water wasn't just his discovery. It was a responsibility. He had found it, but it didn't belong to him. It belonged to the thirsty. He shared his meager supply of food with the Millers, and they huddled together in the lantern light, listening to the storm rage impotently above them. He had chosen not just to survive, but to serve. The storm blew itself out by morning, leaving the air washed clean and a thin layer of fresh dust on everything. The world outside was calm, the sky a brilliant, cloudless blue. The Miller family emerged from the cistern blinking in the bright light, looking like people who had witnessed a resurrection. Mr. Miller, a plain-spoken farmer, shook Caleb's hand with a grip of iron, his eyes filled with a gratitude too deep for words. "You saved us," he said simply. "I don't know how we can ever repay you." Caleb just shook his head. "No payment needed. Just be safe on your way." He gave them a full cask of water, enough to last them well past redemption. As their repaired wagon rolled away, Caleb knew his quiet life on Whisperwind Point was over. The Millers arrived in town before noon, and their story spread through the dry streets like a flood. They spoke of a mad dust storm, a hidden door in the rock, and a vast underground lake of fresh water. They spoke of the quiet, solitary man who had taken them in and saved their lives. At first, the townspeople were skeptical. It sounded like a fever dream, a tale born of desperation. But the Millers were earnest, their story unwavering. By mid-afternoon, a small procession of riders was making its way out to Caleb's land. Silas Blackwood was at their head, his face a mask of disbelief and suspicion. Several of the ranchers whose land bordered the drought line were with him, their expressions a mixture of hope and doubt. Mr. Abernathy, the county clerk, was there too, carrying his heavy ledger of deeds and maps. Caleb met them at the entrance to the cistern. He didn't say a word, just stood aside and gestured for them to enter. One by one, they stepped out of the harsh sunlight and into the cool, damp dark. A collective gasp went through the group as their eyes adjusted, and they saw the water. They stared in stunned silence, their faces illuminated by the lanterns they carried. Blackwood pushed to the front, his confident swagger gone, replaced by a look of utter shock. He knelt at the water's edge as if to confirm it was real. Meanwhile, Mr. Abernathy had unfolded an old survey map on a flat rock. It was a copy of the original Spanish land grant. He ran his finger along the faded lines, then stopped. "My God," he whispered. "Here it is." He pointed to a tiny, almost illegible annotation in the corner, written in elegant script. "Pozo de Piedra," the well of stone. "It's been here the whole time," the clerk said, looking at Caleb with newfound respect. "The grant specifies that all water rights associated with the Pozo belong to this parcel. It's yours, Mr. Croft. All of it." The ranchers looked from the water to Caleb, their mockery replaced by a dawning, desperate reverence. Silas Blackwood stood up slowly, the dust on his fine coat seeming to mark him with the very land he had tried to swindle. He had been defeated, not by a fight, but by a quiet man's patience, and a truth that had been waiting in the earth all along. Weeks later, the golden light of late afternoon bathed Whisperwind Point in a soft glow. The place was no longer silent. The rhythmic creak of wagon wheels and the low murmur of voices filled the air. A steady, orderly line of families from across the valley came to fill their barrels from the cistern. Caleb had established a simple system, asking for nothing in return, but that each person take only what they needed for their family and their stock. It was not a sale, it was a communion. With the help of the town carpenter, he was slowly repairing the old windmill, crafting new wooden vanes to catch the wind. His old friend, John Carter, had arrived from back east, having heard the news, bringing tools and lumber to help him build a small, sturdy cabin not far from the stone tower. The two men worked together in the comfortable silence of long friendship. Buster, the old horse, stood peacefully in the shade of the newly built corral, watching the proceedings with a placid eye. The land itself seemed to be responding. Patches of green were beginning to appear near the cistern's entrance where water had been spilled, a blush of life against the pale dust. That evening, as the last wagon rolled away, Caleb and John stood by the old stone tower, watching the sun dip below the mountains. The sky was a blaze of color, a spectacle of impossible beauty. John gestured with his chin toward the line of distant homesteads, where lantern lights were beginning to glow like fallen stars. "You saved this valley, Caleb," he said quietly. "They're already calling this place Croft's Spring. What are you going to call it, for real?" Caleb placed a hand on the warm stone of the tower, feeling the faint, deep hum of the earth beneath it. He thought of the mocking laughter, the old woman's riddle, the long days of digging, and the look on the faces of the Miller children as they drank the cool, clear water. He looked out at the land, his land, which was now inextricably tied to the lives of dozens of others. "It was never about owning the land," Caleb said. his voice soft but clear in the twilight air. It was about listening to it. Thank you for joining us for this story of quiet strength and hidden hope. If you believe that the greatest treasures are often the ones the world has forgotten, give this story a like, and be sure to subscribe for more tales of the frontier spirit and the enduring power of patience. We'll see you for the next story.